Hi, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health. I'm Nels and I'm an addiction psychiatrist working in Southern Vermont.
And I'm Robert Stack. I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor and licensed mental health counselor.
Okay. And just a reminder, we've enjoyed the questions that we get, and you can contact us at our Facebook site or our email site. The Facebook address is facebook.com/letstalkvt, and our email is questions@letstalkvt.com. Okay. Now tonight we have a special guest on our show. Beatrice Birch is joining us. She's the founder of Inner Fire, which is a proactive healing community offering people choice dealing with debilitating mental conditions and traumas, and with an emphasis on not using psychotropic medications. So Beatrice, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
It's a pleasure, honor to be able to share about Inner Fire. Yeah.
Good. So I'm curious, so where does, maybe explain to us the concept behind Inner Fire and maybe even the sort of the circumstances that,
Sure.
pushed this to happening.
Yeah. Inner Fire arose really out of questions that clients of mine would come to me and actually say, I hate being medicated. Isn't there a choice? And having lived and worked in Europe for over 30 years, and in really holistic practices, we worked with people with all different conditions and never used these psychotropic meds. So coming back to the United States, it was a real eye-opener. So when individuals would come to me and say, I've got all these feelings inside me and I can't reach them. I used to be able to think clearly, I can't anymore. It's as if the meds have pushed who I really am under the table. This particular man, I was told before I started to work with him, had an IQ of a 5 to 7-year-old. I would say he's pretty profound and pretty observant, and when I agreed with him, he looked at me and said, nobody for 15 years has ever agreed with me, And so the grapevine works, and people started coming to me and saying, I hate being medicated, isn't there a choice? And I basically was the question. I could either lie and say, no, take your medication, or I had to say yes. Yes, there is a choice. And a wonderful website, madinamerica.org, which Robert Whitaker is responsible for. I could turn people onto that website and give them just this broader picture. But one thing that I'd really like to stress with Inner Fire is that it's really all about choice. That's a key word. I would never say to somebody, you should not be medicated. But if somebody wants to be more proactive in their healing process, then that's what Inner Fire is all about, really. And I do believe in this country, this land of freedom and opportunity, such options should be available, And also one other angle I'd say is when somebody says mental health, I actually am thinking soul health. Okay, mental health is a reductionist view. We're talking about the soul of the human being, and I think that's one of the greatest challenges nowadays is our view of the human being is changing so much, and when they're thinking of replacing human beings with robots in nursing homes, you have to beg the question, is there any difference between the human being and a robot? And that, that the human being actually, in my experience over these years, you can actually experience the human being has a body, has a soul, and has a spirit. And because of that, I would have to say that the human being actually is a creator and not a victim. The human being can feel a victim, but that's why we call this initiative Inner Fire. Basically claim it. If you don't claim your inner fire, you're not going to get well. And
one of the things, and I don't mean to start off by an argument here,
sure.
But all my years of working in a hospital, and one of the things that we would stress is the importance of staying on your medication, and the medication stabilizes you. And as a matter of fact, recently, as you may know, in Vermont legislature, there was issues around when can you force somebody to take medication? And the argument's made that they're not rational, they're not sane, and they need to be on meds in order to stabilize and not be a harm to themselves or others. And yet we've had Robert Whitaker on our show, and he was saying, you know, meds, if they're given too long and too often, they're not helpful, that people tend to relapse and to be more. And that was really an eye-opener for me, to really change my perspective on it. But I guess I'm still struggling with that. How do you make that decision about personal safety and intervening and making someone to take psychiatric meds? I mean, I understand this is the land of the free, and I read Counterpoint and I follow those things along, but I'm always sort of torn by it. So I just offer that to you because I'm sure there's people who are listening who are wondering, well, how do you balance that?
Yeah. Well, see, what we have these polarities in this country, where you're either on meds or you're off meds. And when you go seeking help because of a traumatic experience you've had, you're not listened to. The doctor has to see you for a few minutes and just to label you, and then you begin your whole process, you know? And so if you have a situation where we actually begin to take more time for each other, I mean, we're talking about a whole cultural shift, basically, but where we take more time. So for instance, at Inner Fire, we're offering this for only people who either to prevent them from going on meds in the first place, or who want to come off their meds. So we'll have a work program in the morning, and then where you have to work with other people. You know, when we're ill, we're basically egocentric. Yeah, it's just how it is. So we need to work with others. Yeah, and in the work program we would have proper cooking, so people learn how to eat properly. Housekeeping, the way we take care of our house is the way we take care of ourselves. In the biodynamic garden and in the forest. And then in the afternoons, then you would have your one-on-one therapy, and they're all proactive therapies, so nothing is done to you. You know, whether it's the artistic therapy with painting or clay work, or whether it's music therapy or movement therapy. Also massage for some people who've had traumatic experiences, and they would be, let's say, the folks who would be called schizophrenic, who actually live in their periphery. Yeah, they don't dare be in their center. Yeah, and for instance, somebody I know who was sexually abused from the age of 3. If that happened to me, I would either be out there or I would hunker down in here and not want to breathe out. So we're talking about how do we help people dare to come into their center or dare to let go and breathe out. And that's where the artistic therapies are so powerful, so powerful. So, for instance, if someone came to Inner Fire and they were diagnosed with schizophrenia and they heard voices, and so we're not really interested in labels, I'm much more interested in the person's story. And I haven't met someone wrestling with schizophrenia who has not had some traumatic experience in their life. Yeah, but they won't talk about it because they're scared of the repercussions, plus no one will believe them anyway, is the feeling. But with such a person, they probably would not start outside in the garden. Yeah, they would start maybe in the heart of the home, the kitchen, where they need to be in this sort of a space and not be drawn further out by the breeze or the bird song or whatever. But then there are others who are more trapped inside. And so for someone with schizophrenia, clay is amazing work. What can happen with clay? It brings them out of their heads into their fingertips, right? So, and it may sound abstract to you, but it's amazing how people breathe differently. And then you have the other person who is so focused, so afraid to breathe out, so stuck. And that's where, for instance, watercolor comes in. You have the beauty of the luminosity of the colors. You have the watercolor. Water is a living element. You have to be interested to see, how do I control this in that way? And again, you see breathing begin to happen. So each of these therapies would be very specific for the individual. So, for instance, we're planning to start building in this summer, and we would have space for 12 people. It would be a year's commitment, and we would have overnight staff, of course, as well. And everyone would also have a mentor, so when, coming to your question, Robert, when there are challenging times or issues, they have people who are there for them to talk through, you know. And as Robert Whitaker was pointing out, so often they're episodical, you know. And for instance, I know somebody who, he's now in his 60s, and when he was 19 in San Francisco, he had this psychotic break, his very severe psychotic break. It took 3 or 4 policemen to hold him down. And his mother said, I don't want to medicate it. So he went to Dr. John Weir Perry's dialysis house. And in 10 days, went through what he had to go through and was totally fine, and has been totally fine since. And he was so impressed with what happened that he went back and worked there for 3 years. You know, so and these are happening, but if we need to call the humanity out of ourselves, reawaken it to listen and engage, and just take the time.
It doesn't sound like you're talking about anything, say, technological or magical here.
No.
That just sort of, and again, one of the things that we've criticized previously has been the idea that this idea of, you know, the diagnostic and statistical manual is a very sort of, you know, checklist sort of thing, and then you're this or you're that, you're bipolar, you have schizophrenia, you are ADHD, for example, and that then gets lined up very much with medications, and then it doesn't really speak to the variety of how even those supposed, you know, disorders are really on a spectrum with the normal, you know, traits or characteristics.
We're all somewhere in this spectrum, and you know, we can't avoid it. The human being is complicated. Science, the pharmaceutical companies would want us to be black or white, easily labeled, but we're not. You know, and I think one of the most important things of all is to claim our feelings. Because we're human beings, if I can claim that I am so angry right now, or I am so lonely, or I am so sad, because I'm a human being, I can then say, okay, and what am I going to do about it? You know, an animal doesn't have that freedom. You know, it's going to react. And sometimes as human beings, we do react. And in the 2 prisons that I've worked in, you know, I meet a lot of amazing, wonderful men. They reacted, rather than use their humanity to think, I could pick up a gun, I could go chop wood, I could go play music, I could go for a walk, I could go talk to somebody, you know. And I think that's the thing, we have to change our view of the human being.
Yeah. And yet, you know, when I worked in the hospital, we both worked there, they used to have activity specialists there.
Yeah.
And it was always amazing to see some of our clients who, you know, had a history of drug and alcohol use, very street people and everything. And if you could just convince them to engage in the activity, whether it's collages or whatever it might be, yoga, whatever it might be, they almost invariably would come away and say, that was pretty cool. Yeah. Totally. I really like that.
Totally. And then you have to think, what's happening inside them? It's a breath. I did it. I can do it. And I have a wonderful man I'm working with now who would be labeled schizophrenic. And when he first would come in, he could only stay for a moment or 2 and would go. And after these couple of years of working together, he is now doing the most incredible sculptural work. And I so wish the rest of the staff could see what he's doing, or that his family could see this side of him. But he knows I believe in him. He knows, you know, it's this may sound strange, but it dawned on me once, I feel like I'm a fisherwoman. And I fish, I'm not religious, I fish for what I call the divine creative self. And funnily enough, I'll find it whether it's through the clay, whether it's through the watercolor, you know, because you're awakening the creator in them. And when they see that they can do things that they never imagined they could do, they're empowering. And we have this awful term in this country where one refers to maintaining. Goodness, you know, I'd say we maintain tractors and trucks, but we do not maintain human beings. Human beings need to be nurtured and cared for. And one woman who spoke up at an open dialogue conference I was at, you know, and sometimes you know, I've wondered about, am I crazy to do inner fire, to be honest, you know? And then she stands up and she says, I've been through the whole system. I've been forcibly medicated. I've had electroshock treatment. What made a difference to me was when the doctor listened to me. And I'm thinking, that's not rocket science.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, we have, yeah.
It's funny, there was a physician, William Osler, from about 200 years ago, and a lot of quotes are attributed to him, so I have that as right, but that the physician's duty is to entertain the patient while they heal themselves. And I think that in many ways in medicine, and particularly mental health, is sort of a foreign concept to let people be, to not intervene, to not prescribe, and sort of let the body, let the brain do what it naturally does, and to go through some rhythms and not feel the need to just sort of push medications and you know, forceful interventions.
Well, I was very interested. We have what we call 9-day sanctuaries where people can come and have a taste for these 9 days of what it would be like to engage with us at Inner Fire. And we're planning to start a day program. Until we've built the building we still need to raise more money, but where people who can live independently could come to us from 8 in the morning till 8:30 or 9 at night. And what's been key has been simply the rhythm. You get up at 7, you do this, you have lunch, you do this, you have supper, you have an evening group activity, and then you go to bed. That has been all the seekers who we've had come to us. That's been the secret, but it's very difficult because they come from such chaotic lives.
Right.
You know.
I was very active, but I was involved with people who were trying to get the single-payer system in Vermont. And one time we had a meeting and we invited people to come in and talk to some of their concerns and worries about it, like practitioners. And one group that came, and there was a number of them that came that were alternative medicine. And they were sort of worried about we're not going to get funded.
Yeah.
And one of the things that sort of, we talked about this last year, 2 years ago, when we were talking about single payer, is that we didn't want to duplicate the system. Like all they were talking about was changing how you pay. They weren't They weren't talking about how we're going to do things differently. Like, you know what I mean? Like and I think that's what was missing, because when they focused on the money, they said, you know, we just don't have the money. And that's why we're not going to do it. When I think the focus should have been, how would we do this differently? How would we provide mental health? To get results. Right, or addiction treatment, whatever way you want to think about it. But it was always based on economics. It was always based on the dollar. And so, you know, even when we were talking about that single payer, you know, it was always this idea, well, we'll just become the insurance company, if you will. And in other words, but we'll do everything the way we're doing now, and then at the end they decide, well, we can't afford it. And I was sort of glad to hear what you just said. I mean, I think that, you know, if they were a little more open-minded about the services we provide and how to approach this, it might look differently.
Yeah. Because if we look internationally, the U.S. spends more money per capita on healthcare than any other country in the world, especially compared to the ones with the same sort of economic standing as us. I mean, as much as 50% more. Yet, when you look at quality indicators for the care that's received,
it's awful.
We're in like 35th place, with many countries ahead of us. So. Other countries are doing things differently. You'd mentioned Open Dialogue, which is a Finnish system employing, you know, basically everybody who encircles the person during a crisis, hearing voices in Great Britain. I'd like to hear some more about these. I think you know much more about them than most of us do.
Well, and there's also a wonderful thing called healing homes in Sweden, where individuals can go and live in oftentimes it's a farming family, you know, where there are jobs to do. And see, that's the thing. There aren't meaningful jobs to do for a lot of people these days, you know, where you actually milk a cow, you connect with the cow, you milk the cow, and you know, there's this a wonderful documentary on it, where this young woman is having a sort of a kind of a breakdown, or is terribly anxious, and the farmer wife says, "We have to stop. We have to go milk the cows." And she stops, and they go milk the cows, you know. And that's the thing, is that people aren't actually busy enough doing meaningful work, you know. And Open Dialogue, that's a wonderful initiative in northern Finland. It's been going for over 20 years. And they now also have, they used to have a high level of schizophrenia in northern Finland. They have hardly any now. And that was a very transparent system where when someone had a break, they would contact the clinic, 2 people would come out, and with the family, the whole family involved, the boyfriend, the girlfriend, they would talk. And the professionals would not say, we'll be right back and go and talk out back, but they would communicate together. So it's totally transparent, and the individual could be part of their healing process. And they're respected, you see.
Dr. Fisherman, we had she worked with us, and she almost wanted to give me, like, Robert, your Pollyanna about this business, because what we would need is a cultural shift. Remember that she was making that point, that, and not only would the patients have to think differently about medications and everything, but everybody else would.
Yeah.
Like, it's almost like sometimes, like, family members or communities, they don't want to put up with people who are a little different or don't seem to be
homogenizing.
Right.
Totally.
And remember that? And Dr. Fishman was saying, Robert, it isn't just changing the providers, it would be a cultural way of thinking about it.
But for instance, at Inner Fire, we'll be using a homeopath as our doctor. And the homeopath will look at the constitution of the whole human being, because our idiosyncrasies, our twitches or our back or whatever is part of a bigger picture, right? So again, we've got this reductionist view where we look at the toe or we look at the heel or, whatever.
We look at the symptom.
We look only at the symptom rather than the whole person. And so that's where taking that into account, and you respect the human being. And there's actually no judgment involved, because to be a human being is a very challenging thing to be.
Now, earlier on, you mentioned the word soul, which for a lot of people will just shut them down.
Okay.
And I'm a believer, and Nels has heard me talk about spirituality. Sure. I think it works well with alcoholism and drug addiction. I think it's an important piece. And it seems as if in our culture, we sort of not only lost religion for whatever reason, like in the 19th century, 95% of Americans believed in some religion was, but as we become more secular, we've sort of lost spirituality. Yeah. As we, you know what I mean? I don't mind people walking to the side and, I don't like the politics of Catholicism, or I don't like the politics of Mormonism, whatever it might be, but they don't get the spirituality. Yeah. And it's almost.
Well, I could give.
Go ahead.
Shall I give a picture, Robert?
Yeah.
Because, in a presentation I was making once, I was thinking, well, how can I make this really? How can people get it? You know? And so it's really crude. It's a crude image. Okay. But so you've got a hinge.
As in rough, I hope.
Yeah. So you have let's say the hinge of a door. Okay. You have to line up the hinge. Okay.
Yeah.
Before you put the bolt in.
Right. Spike.
If the hinge is lined up, then the bolt will go in and the door will work. Right? So the hinge is made up of what I would call the body, the soul, and the soul has 2 parts to it, I would say. There's one part which is called the life body or the etheric body, which has to do with our habits, our rhythms. If we can, with young children, give them a rhythmic life will be so much easier for them. And then we have what's called the astral body, which has to do with our emotions, our sympathies and our antipathies. So if you look at illness, you can see if there's some trauma that's happened somewhere, then there's going to be a cramping on the soul level. And maybe a good example is there's a place that I visited which helps detox people. And we were invited to their graduation, and I was watching this one young man who was graduating, and he looked terrified. And it reaffirmed my experience of they've detoxed the physical body. Yeah, he's no longer on the cocaine, he's no longer on the psychotropic meds, but they didn't do anything on the soul level, you see? And this picture of I would say, you can't take something away without putting something in its place. Right. And that's where this whole nurturing of the human being to claim their voice. It doesn't matter. Your feelings are your feelings. No one can say you shouldn't have those feelings. They're my feelings.
Right.
And so to nurture that, And so this is where, and then you can see when the spirit can enter in, when, and that's what all these therapies I mentioned are about, and the homeopathy also, is helping to realign after trauma these experiences so the spirit can get in, you see, and you can work and be creative as a human being, and that's the creator, and then you don't feel a victim. But life is a tightrope as a human being. We fall in and out of balance, but that's what it's about.
And we've read some work by Bruce Alexander. He's either, I think, a sociologist or anthropologist, maybe a psychologist in Canada, and writing about how when people are disconnected from their culture or from the earth, but mostly about cultures, how like indigenous people with industrialization then lose that culture, and you see then, he's particularly writing about addiction, but then he sees more of these problems with addiction sort of rising from that.
Right.
He's most famous for a study about rats that initially had the mice pushing the lever for cocaine, and talking about how sort of naturally addicting cocaine was, and then he put them in what he called an enriched cage, offering them also cocaine and water yet again, but with other rodents in there, other toys, playthings, food and such, and they didn't go for the cocaine because they lived in this enriched environment.
Yeah, exactly. And so many, where, I mean, I think it's a very serious problem, the youth these days and the technology. They're in their phones and they don't communicate. How do we communicate as a human being, And this feeling of also being needed. We all need to feel needed. We're all social human beings, and when, that's, and I think as a practitioner, I've oftentimes connected, people who, an elderly blind person, well, there's a younger man who can read. Matchmaking in a certain way. How can we engage with each other?
So Beatrice, this sounds like a lot more work, and maybe even a lot more expensive, say, than just prescribing medications would be.
Yeah, but it's so much more enriching. I think I would imagine most psychiatrists are depressed, actually. It's so heartening to see how people evolve and grow. And it's like, yes, that's it. And when they say, I don't want to be medicated, I hear that as their inner fire saying, don't do this to me. Don't disempower me.
I mentioned this last week, I think we were talking about it, and I said, one of the complaints patients used to say is, I want to be off my meds. I don't want to, and I don't want, and that would be the struggle. You'd end up talking to them. Well, like I used to try and help people with sobriety, and I used to tell them, I was trained to believe that for a lot of people, their relapse starts when they stop taking their meds. Because that would often happen. They would relapse to drugs and alcohol. And so I in some ways, I feel like I'm part of that system because I believe that. I thought it was true.
Yeah, but you have to put something in its place.
Right.
That's the thing. And to get people out of their heads into their limbs, that is magic. That is magic.
Well, that's therapy. That's the kind of therapists that don't get paid. They get eliminated.
Yeah.
But then we're seeing too that these lower medication approaches are being shown to improve the function of people when you look many years out. So if we had a longer-term point of view, I hope somebody analyzes that one day to see what really would be the sort of the most cost-effective way. But we should probably give you a chance to wrap up since we're almost towards the end of the show.
Well, just what can I say? We're maybe just a little bit about inner fire. It's about choice. It's about a whole new, or not really that new, view of the human being, remembering who the human being actually is. And we're really hoping to start, we just need, as I say, to raise a bit more money to finish the building. And then we are really eager to invite people who, and well, a very important thing is it must be available for people regardless of their finances. So sponsorship.
Thank you so much for being on our show.
It was wonderful to have you with us tonight.
Thank you.
I loved it.
Yeah,
Thank
great.
you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.